The automatic doors at Walmart slide open with that familiar whoosh, and I step into the harsh, fluorescent glow that has become the backdrop to so many exhausted evenings in my life. The store smells like floor cleaner and warm rotisserie chicken, that peculiar combination that somehow feels both industrial and comforting at the same time. I've just finished a 12-hour shift at Grant Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio, working the cardiac floor where the moments between crisis and calm can stretch into eternity, and all I want is to go home, kick off my shoes, and collapse into my recliner with leftover chili and my golden retriever Molly pressed against my leg. But the refrigerator is empty, and Molly is out of treats, and so here I am, pushing a cart with a wobbly wheel down the aisles of the Walmart on Hilliard Rome Road, trying to remember if I need milk or if there's still some in the fridge at home. What I don't know, what I can't possibly know as I toss a loaf of wheat bread into my cart, is that this ordinary Thursday evening in early March is about to intersect with another life in a way that will echo through the next several months of my existence. I don't know that the woman standing 3 people ahead of me in line at Register 6 is about to become a pivotal figure in my story. I don't know that her declined debit card and quiet dignity are going to force me to confront every assumption I've ever made about money, class, and belonging. All I know is that my feet ache, my back is stiff from bending over patient charts, and I'm calculating whether I have enough energy to reheat chili or if I should just eat a bowl of cereal and call it dinner. The line moves slowly, the way it always does when you're exhausted and just want to be anywhere else. There's a young dad in front of me with 2 kids who keep grabbing things off the impulse buy shelves and asking in increasingly loud voices if they can have candy, gum, tiny toys that will break within hours. The dad looks as tired as I feel, his eyes glazed over with that particular parental exhaustion that comes from making decisions all day and having no energy left for the small battles. In front of him is a college-age kid buying ramen noodles and frozen pizza, the universal meal plan of someone either broke or too busy to care about nutrition. And in front of him, at the front of our little queue of the weary and the waiting, stands a woman who catches my attention for reasons I can't immediately articulate. She is somewhere in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, with gray hair pulled back in a neat, practical style and a navy blue wool coat that looks like something from another era, the kind of coat my grandmother might have worn to church on Sunday mornings. There is nothing flashy about her, nothing that draws the eye in a crowded store, but there is something about the way she carries herself that strikes me. She stands straight, with the posture of someone who has spent a lifetime holding herself a certain way, and she moves with a quiet deliberateness that suggests competence and self-possession. Her cart contains simple things, eggs and milk and bread, a couple cans of vegetable soup, some bananas, the kind of groceries that whisper of a solitary life or simple habits. Nothing extravagant, nothing indulgent, just the quiet necessities of existence. The cashier, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that reads Brenda, scans the items with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has performed this same set of motions thousands of times. The total appears on the little screen facing the customer, and Brenda says, in that flat voice that all cashiers seem to develop, "Your total is $52.13. The woman in the navy coat reaches into her purse and pulls out a debit card, sliding it into the machine with practiced ease. We all wait, the way we always wait, for the little beep that signals approval and the transaction's completion. But the sound that comes is not the cheerful beep of acceptance. It's a different sound, a harsher sound, and the little screen blinks with a word that no one wants to see in a checkout line, especially not when there are people waiting behind them. Declined. Brenda the cashier frowns, but politely the way you frown when you see this happen a dozen times a day and it's no longer surprising, just unfortunate. "Would you like to try again?" she asks, and the woman in the navy coat says, "Yes, of course," and I can see a flush creep up her cheeks, that particular pink that comes from a specific kind of embarrassment, the kind where you're not just embarrassed for yourself, but for the inconvenience you're causing others. She slides the card again. We wait again. And again, the machine delivers its verdict, that harsh beep, that blinking word. Declined. Something in my chest tightens. I've been there. Not me exactly, but my mother, years ago, in a grocery store in Newark, Ohio, where I grew up. I remember standing beside her in a checkout line, maybe 9 or 10 years old, watching her count out food stamps and WIC vouchers while the people behind us sighed and shifted and looked at their watches. I remember the way her shoulders hunched slightly, the way she kept her voice light and cheerful even as her eyes told a different story. I remember the deep relief when the numbers added up and we could leave with our groceries, and I remember the hot shame when they didn't and we had to put things back. That memory is decades old, but it rises now as I watch this woman in the navy coat do something that breaks my heart in its quiet dignity. She begins removing items from the conveyor belt. First the bananas, placed gently on the small shelf beside the register where returned items wait to be restocked. Then one of the cans of soup. Then the milk. She doesn't complain. She doesn't argue. She doesn't sigh or huff or make excuses about the bank making a mistake or the card being old or any of the dozen defensive things people say when their finances are exposed in public. She simply says, in a soft voice, "Well, I suppose I don't need everything tonight," and continues the quiet work of calculating what she can live without. Brenda, the cashier, looks uncomfortable. "I can suspend the order if you'd like to call your bank," she offers, but the woman shakes her head quickly. "Oh no, that won't be necessary," she says. "I'll just take what I can." She is trying to make this easier for everyone, trying not to hold up the line, trying not to make a scene. And something about that effort, that careful consideration of others even in her own moment of need, hits me harder than I expect it to. Maybe it's the long shift. Maybe it's the memories of my mother. Maybe it's the accumulated weight of years of watching people struggle in small ways that go unnoticed by the world. Or maybe it's simply that sometimes you see a moment where kindness would cost very little, and not doing it would cost your conscience a lot more. Before I have time to overthink it, before I can calculate whether it's appropriate or welcome or intrusive, I step forward and hand my card to Brenda, the cashier. "I've got it," I say. The woman in the navy coat turns to me, startled, her eyes wide with surprise. "Oh no, dear," she says quickly. "That's not necessary." But I shake my head. "It's all right," I tell her. "Just groceries. It's been a long day. Feels good to do one decent thing." Brenda runs my card without comment, the receipt prints, and the transaction is complete. $52.13, a tank of gas, a nice dinner out. Nothing that will break my budget, but apparently something that matters enormously to the woman now, standing in front of me with an expression I can't quite read. She looks at me for a long moment, and I see gratitude in her eyes, but also embarrassment and something else, something that looks almost like assessment, like she is trying to understand why a stranger would do this. "Thank you," she says quietly. "You didn't have to do that." I shrug, suddenly awkward with the weight of the moment. "Long day," I repeat. "Feels good to do one decent thing." She smiles faintly, the kind of smile that suggests she isn't used to accepting help, that her pride is wrestling with her gratitude, and I can see both emotions playing across her face. I pick up my own bag before the conversation can stretch any longer, before the moment can become weighted with expectations I don't know how to fulfill. Because sometimes the best kindness is the kind that doesn't linger, the kind that doesn't demand acknowledgement or reciprocation, the kind that simply happens and then disappears into the ordinary flow of life. The cold March air hits my face as I walk out of Walmart, and I load my groceries into my car with hands that are starting to shake a little from exhaustion. By the time I pull into my driveway 40 minutes later, the whole encounter has already begun fading into the background of the day, filed away in my mind alongside all the other small moments of human connection that string together to make a life. Just one small moment. $52. A stranger in a grocery line. I assume I will never see her again, and I am perfectly at peace with that assumption. Some kindnesses are meant to be complete in themselves, without continuation, without sequel. Life has a curious way of circling back, of drawing threads together that seemed forever separate, and 3 weeks later, standing at the front door of the Whitaker estate outside Cincinnati, I will hear my fiancé speak words that make my heart stutter in my chest. "You've met her before," Daniel says, and suddenly that quiet moment in a Walmart checkout line will come rushing back with the force of a wave breaking, because the woman whose groceries I paid for is about to become my future mother-in-law. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand the full weight of what happened in that doorway, you need to understand how I got there in the first place. You need to understand the years that shaped me, the losses that defined me, the particular relationship with money and class that I carried into that moment like invisible luggage. Because the truth is, I never expected to be standing in front of a house like the Whittaker estate. Not in my wildest imagination, not in any version of my future I had constructed for myself. I grew up in Newark, Ohio, about 40 miles east of Columbus, in the kind of town where people recognized each other's trucks in the grocery store parking lot and waved whether they liked each other or not, where everyone knew everyone else's business and privacy was more theory than practice. My father worked at a tool and die shop until the plant closed in the early 2000s, another casualty of the manufacturing exodus that hollowed out so many Midwestern towns. My mother worked the front desk at a dentist's office, answering phones and scheduling appointments, and dealing with patients who were always either in pain or anxious about being in pain. We weren't poor exactly, at least not in the way that some families were poor, but there wasn't much extra. Vacations were usually a rented cabin at Buckeye Lake, close enough to drive in a few hours and cheap enough to afford for a long weekend. Christmas meant careful budgeting, lists made and prioritized, a few gifts selected with intention rather than abundance. And if something broke, you tried to fix it yourself before even considering replacement, a philosophy my father applied to everything from toaster ovens to cars. When I was 19, my father got sick. It started small, a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, a tiredness that seemed deeper than normal aging. By the time the doctors figured out it was lung cancer, it had already spread to his lymph nodes, and the prognosis was measured in months rather than years. I watched him shrink over those final months, watched the man who could fix anything become someone who needed help getting out of bed. And I watched the nurses who cared for him, the way they treated him with dignity even when he had almost none left physically, the way they looked at him and saw a person rather than a diagnosis. That mattered. That stuck with me in a way that shaped the entire trajectory of my adult life. After he died, my mother and I leaned on each other even harder than before, the two of us against a world that suddenly felt much larger and more uncertain. I had been considering nursing school before his illness, but after his death, the decision crystallized into certainty. I wanted to be the kind of person who could do what those nurses had done, who could offer comfort and competence in the midst of life's most difficult moments. I enrolled in a nursing program at a community college, worked part-time jobs to pay for books and supplies, and spent 3 intense years learning how to care for people in their most vulnerable moments. Years later, working the cardiac floor at Grant Medical Center in Columbus, I met Daniel Whittaker. Not at the hospital, surprisingly, but at a hardware store on a Tuesday evening when I had stopped by after work to pick up a replacement shower head, the old one having developed an alarming tendency to spray sideways like a lawn sprinkler rather than deliver a steady stream of water. Daniel was standing in the plumbing aisle, staring at 2 different adapters with an expression of pure frustration, and something about the scene made me pause. He was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a navy button-down shirt and jeans that probably cost more than my entire outfit, but what struck me was how out of place he looked, like someone who didn't spend much time in hardware stores and knew it. "Need help?" I asked, because I couldn't help myself, because my father had raised me to offer assistance when I saw someone struggling. He glanced over and laughed a little, the laugh of someone slightly embarrassed but not too proud to accept aid. "I'm starting to think the plumbing industry has its own language," he admitted. Turns out he had just bought a condo in Columbus and was trying to fix a leaky shower himself instead of calling a plumber, partly to save money and partly, I suspected, because he wanted to prove he could. I showed him which adapter he needed, explained the difference between the 2 options he had been considering, and he was so grateful that he insisted on buying me coffee as a thank you. One coffee turned into dinner a week later. Dinner turned into more dinners, into movie nights and museum visits and long drives through the Ohio countryside. And before I fully understood how it had happened, I found myself dating a man whose life looked very different from mine in ways that became increasingly apparent as our relationship deepened. Daniel worked for Whittaker Development, his family's real estate company, a business that built office parks and apartment complexes and shopping centers all across Ohio and beyond. He never bragged about it, never dropped names or flashed money in an ostentatious way, but you couldn't miss the signs if you were paying attention. The watch he wore, subtle but expensive. The way restaurant hosts seemed to recognize him. The casual mentions of family, trips to places I had only seen in magazines. And eventually, carefully, the stories about his parents. His father had started the business in the late 1970s with one small commercial building, a risk that had paid off beyond anyone's expectations. By the time Daniel was born, Whitaker Development had projects in 3 states. By the time I met him, they had enough money that people sometimes lowered their voices a little when they said the family name, a tone of respect that bordered on reverence. The first time Daniel mentioned meeting his parents, I felt my stomach tighten with a particular kind of anxiety I hadn't felt since I was a child, the anxiety of someone about to enter a world they don't quite belong to. "You'll like them," Daniel assured me. "They're good people." That phrase, good people, can mean a lot of things. Sometimes it means kind and welcoming. Sometimes it means polite but distant. And sometimes it means people who expect you to prove you belong, who will measure you against standards they won't explicitly state. I had spent most of my adult life surrounded by regular folks, teachers and nurses and mechanics, and retired factory workers. People who didn't care how fancy your shoes were as long as you showed up when someone needed help. The prospect of entering a world of country clubs and charity galas and quiet judgments about pedigree made me feel like I was preparing for a test I hadn't studied for. He dated almost a year before Daniel suggested visiting his parents' home outside Cincinnati. "It's not a big deal," he said one evening while we were making spaghetti in my small kitchen, his tone casual in a way that felt slightly forced. "You're going to love my mom, she's thoughtful." I laughed nervously. "That sounds like something every son says about his mother." He shook his head. "She's different. She notices things. She pays attention to who people really are." That word, thoughtful, stuck with me. It could mean considerate, or it could mean evaluative. I wasn't sure which definition applied to Margaret Whitaker, but I was about to find out. We scheduled dinner for a Saturday evening in early spring. Daniel drove, and the highway south toward Cincinnati was lined with fields still waking up from winter, patches of brown grass and bare trees blurring past the windows. I had brought a small casserole dish of homemade baked ziti, my mother's recipe, because she had always told me it was polite to bring something when visiting someone's home. Daniel didn't say anything about it, but I noticed a faint smile when I placed it carefully on the back seat, a smile that I couldn't quite interpret. Was he touched? Amused? I couldn't tell, and my anxiety increased in direct proportion to my uncertainty. "You're nervous," he observed as we drove, his eyes on the road. "A little," I admitted. "You don't need to be. That's easy for you to say, it's your family." He reached over and squeezed my hand. "They care about character more than anything, trust me." I hoped that was true. I hoped that character meant the same thing to them that it meant to me, that it meant kindness and integrity and the willingness to show up for people when they needed you. But I had learned, over years of crossing between different worlds, that words can have different definitions depending on who is speaking them. About 20 minutes outside Cincinnati, the highway turned into a smaller road that wound through wooded hills, past farms that gave way to larger estates, properties with long driveways and carefully maintained landscaping. Eventually, Daniel turned onto a private drive that seemed to stretch on forever, and that's when I saw the house. House might not even be the right word. It was more like a stone estate, the kind of place you expect to see in a magazine about architecture or a period film about wealthy families. Tall windows, wide front porch, perfect landscaping that probably required a full-time crew to maintain. The driveway curved past a fountain before stopping near the front steps, and my heart began beating faster, not with excitement but with a sinking sense of being out of my depth. Daniel parked the car and turned to me. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," I replied, which was the honest truth, though ready might have been overstating it. We walked up the steps together and he rang the doorbell. Inside, I heard faint footsteps, measured and unhurried. Then the door opened and Daniel smiled and said those words that would change everything. "You've met her before." And that's when I heard the voice from inside the house, a voice that seemed to reach into my memory and pull out a moment I had almost forgotten. "Oh, it's you." My stomach turned, because I knew that voice. I knew it with a certainty that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the gut. And suddenly, the memory of a quiet woman in a Walmart checkout line came rushing back with stunning clarity. The navy blue coat, the gray hair pulled back neatly, the declined card, the bananas being set aside, the $52.13 that had seemed so insignificant in the moment but now loomed large with implications I couldn't yet grasp. Words came from somewhere behind Daniel, calm and unmistakably familiar. For a second, my brain refused to connect the dots, refused to accept what the evidence was telling it. The foyer was bright with afternoon light, the floor polished marble that gleamed like a mirror, a staircase curving upward like something from an old movie about wealthy families and their secrets. And standing halfway between the living room and the front door was the woman from Walmart. Same gray hair pulled back neatly. Same composed posture. Same gentle eyes that had looked at me across a checkout counter 3 weeks earlier. Except now she wasn't standing beside a conveyor belt of groceries in a fluorescent-lit store. She was standing inside one of the largest homes I had ever seen, a home that spoke of generations of accumulated wealth, of opportunities and privileges I could barely imagine. Daniel stepped aside and smiled like everything made perfect sense, like this was a delightful coincidence rather than a moment that threatened to upend everything I thought I understood about the previous weeks. "Emily," he said, gesturing toward the woman, "this is my mother." I felt my fingers tighten around the casserole dish I was still clutching like some kind of protective talisman. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence stretched, filled with things unsaid, questions unasked. Then the woman, Margaret Whittaker, walked forward. She looked directly at me, and I could tell she recognized me instantly, the way you recognize someone you've met before even if you can't immediately place where or when. A faint smile touched her lips. "Well," she said quietly, "this is quite a surprise." My mind was racing. The Walmart line, the declined card, the groceries being set aside one by one. The $52. None of it made sense in the context of this house, this foyer, this life of obvious abundance. Why would a woman who lived in a house like this have her card declined buying basic groceries? The questions circled in my mind, growing larger with each passing second, demanding an answer I couldn't provide. Margaret stepped forward and reached for the casserole dish in my hands. "Let me take that," she said warmly. "You didn't need to bring anything." "It's just baked ziti," I replied, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "My mom's recipe." "That sounds wonderful." She carried it toward the kitchen, and Daniel closed the door behind us, shutting out the bright afternoon and sealing us inside a world I wasn't sure I belonged in. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Daniel said softly, his expression somewhere between amused and concerned. "I might have," I replied. He laughed. "What happened at Walmart? You've been weird since I mentioned it in the car." I took a breath. "Your mom's card declined," I said slowly. "She was buying groceries. The total was $52. When the card didn't work, she started putting the food back." His eyebrows lifted. "You paid," I nodded. Daniel leaned back against the wall and laughed under his breath. "Well, that's one way to meet the family." "I feel like I stepped into the wrong story," I said, and I meant it. The narrative I had constructed about the woman in the Walmart line, about her quiet dignity in the face of financial difficulty, had just been shattered by the reality of this house, this wealth, this life that looked nothing like what I had assumed. He shook his head. "No, you stepped into the right one, just maybe not the one you were expecting." Just then, Margaret returned from the kitchen. Her expression had softened, the polite distance of a hostess giving way to something more genuine. "Dinner will be ready shortly," she said. "Why don't we sit in the living room for a moment?" The living room looked like something out of a design magazine. Tall windows overlooking a garden that probably required a small army of landscapers. Leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Bookshelves filled with hardbound volumes that looked like they had been read rather than merely displayed. A fireplace large enough to warm an entire cabin. Margaret sat across from me while Daniel poured iced tea from a crystal pitcher. For a moment, the three of us simply settled into our chairs, each lost in our own thoughts. Then Margaret spoke. "I must admit," she said gently, "I never expected to see you again." "Neither did I replied honestly. Daniel looked curious. "Mom, what exactly happened?" Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "Well, Daniel, I went to Walmart for a few groceries. When I reached the register, my card didn't work." She glanced at me. Your fiancé stepped forward and paid for everything without making a fuss. Daniel smiled proudly. That sounds like Emily. I felt my cheeks warm. It wasn't a big deal. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Perhaps not to you, she said, but kindness rarely feels small to the person receiving it. Her tone wasn't dramatic, just honest, and I found myself appreciating that even as my confusion deepened. Still, something in the room felt slightly tense. Not hostile, but thoughtful, like everyone was quietly examining the moment from a different angle, seeing different implications in what had happened. Daniel stood up. I'll check on Dad, he said. He's probably in the study. Once he disappeared down the hallway, the room grew quiet again, and Margaret looked at me carefully. You must have been surprised tonight, she observed. That's an understatement, I replied. She smiled faintly. I imagine you have questions. I hesitated, trying to figure out how to articulate what I was feeling. I just didn't expect someone who lives here to have trouble buying groceries, I finally said. Margaret nodded slowly. That's fair. She looked toward the window, thoughtful. You see, Emily, wealth has a curious effect on the way people behave around you. I wasn't sure what she meant yet, but I was paying close attention. When people know who you are, she continued, they treat you differently, sometimes better than they should. She looked back at me. Sometimes they treat you worse. Her words hung quietly in the air. So occasionally, she said. I go places where no one knows my name, like Walmart. Yes, I said slowly, starting to understand. To see how the world feels when people believe you're ordinary. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Does that happen often? I asked. Margaret smiled slightly. More than you might think. Daniel returned a moment later with his father, Robert Whittaker, a tall man with silver hair and the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent decades making business decisions that affected thousands of lives. He greeted me warmly, asked about my work at the hospital, and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. Dinner followed shortly after, and the meal itself was warm and pleasant. Conversation flowed easily around topics like Daniel's work, stories about my nursing job, thoughtful questions from Robert about the challenges of healthcare. Margaret listened more than she spoke, but every once in a while, our eyes met across the table, and I couldn't help wondering something. Was that moment at Walmart truly just coincidence, or had I walked into something more complicated than I realized? Because sometimes in wealthy families, even the smallest moments can become quiet tests of character. And I had a strange feeling that my $52 grocery purchase might mean more to them than I understood. If you've lived long enough, you learn there are two kinds of silence. There's the comfortable kind, the kind that settles over a kitchen table after supper when everybody knows each other well enough not to fill every second with words, the kind that speaks of ease and familiarity and belonging. And then there's the other kind, the kind that feels polished and careful and measured, the kind that makes you aware of every sound you make, every movement, every breath. That was the kind of silence I felt at the Whittakers' dinner table that night. Nothing was openly wrong. No one was rude. The food was excellent, each course served on china that probably had a history longer than my entire life. Robert Whittaker asked me about the hospital in the same even tone a man might use discussing the weather or a board meeting, polite and interested, but somehow also evaluative. But underneath all that civility, I felt something else. Attention. I had the strange sense that I was being observed from several angles at once. Not like prey exactly, but like a person being quietly sized up, assessed for fit, evaluated against some standard I couldn't see. Margaret's face gave little away. She asked about my mother. She asked where I grew up. She asked how long I had worked in cardiac care. All reasonable questions, good questions even. Still, each answer felt like it carried more weight than it should have, like each response was being filed away somewhere for later consideration. At one point, Robert buttered a dinner roll and said, "Nursing takes a certain stamina. Not everyone is built for that kind of work." "I suppose that's true," I replied. "What drew you to it?" I took a sip of water before answering. "My father was sick for a while before he died. The nurses who cared for him made a hard situation feel a little less frightening. I never forgot that." Robert nodded. "That makes sense." Margaret looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, I thought I saw something soften in her expression, a flicker of something that might have been understanding or respect. Dinner itself moved along without incident. Daniel told a story about a contractor who had accidentally ordered the wrong roofing material for an apartment complex near Dayton, and Robert laughed while Margaret shook her head and said, "That's what happens when people stop reading details." It was the kind of family moment that could have happened at any table in America, and I found myself relaxing slightly, letting myself believe that maybe I had been overthinking things, that my anxiety about class and wealth and belonging was just my own insecurity talking. We moved on to coffee in the sitting room after dessert. By then, it was nearly 9 o'clock and I was ready to leave, not because the evening had gone badly, but because it felt like holding a smile too long. My cheeks were tired. My posture was tired. And my mind kept circling back to Walmart, to that card, to that moment, to this house, and what it all meant. When Margaret left the room to take a call and Robert stepped into his study, Daniel walked me toward the hall near the front door. "You're doing great," he said quietly. "Am I?" I asked, and I could hear the edge in my own voice. He smiled. "You are." I lowered my voice. "Your mother shops at Walmart in secret." He let out a breath through his nose. "Well, yes and no. What does that mean?" Daniel leaned against the wall, slipped one hand into his pocket, and looked suddenly less like the calm man who had reassured me on the drive down and more like a son who knew his family's odd habits too well. "My mother has this belief," he said slowly. "She believes that money changes how people behave. She says wealth is useful, but it creates fog. People either flatter you, resent you, or assume things about you before they know you." "That doesn't really answer the question," I said. He nodded. "Sometimes she goes out without using any account people would recognize. No driver, no assistant, no store manager fussing over her. She likes seeing people as they are." I stared at him. "And what exactly was I supposed to be in that situation?" "You weren't supposed to be anything, Emily." He straightened up a little. "I'm serious. My mother does this because she hates being handled. She likes ordinary places, ordinary conversations." "That sounded very noble," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "But it also sounds a little like she's studying people." He went quiet. That silence answered more than his words could have. I folded my arms. "So what was Walmart, some kind of character test?" His face changed. Not angry, not defensive, uncomfortable. "No," he said at last. "Not exactly. Not exactly is not very comforting." He looked toward the living room and then back at me. "My parents have seen people get close to this family for the wrong reasons." There it was. The thing underneath the polished surface, the old fear, the suspicion. I felt my chest tighten, and they think I might be one of those people. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "That's not what I said." "No," I replied. "It's just what you meant. Emily, listen to me. I paid for your mother's groceries because her card declined. I didn't even know her name. I didn't know she lived in a house with a fountain in the driveway, and somehow I'm standing here feeling like I was graded on a test I didn't know I was taking." His expression softened. "That's not fair." "No," I said quietly. "It really isn't." For the first time that night, I wanted to leave immediately. Not dramatically, not in tears, just leave. Go back to my little condo in Columbus, put on sweatpants, and sit with Molly while the whole evening shrank back down to its actual size. Daniel reached for my hand, but I stepped back. I wasn't trying to punish him. I just needed room to breathe, room to think, room to process everything that had happened and everything it might mean. At that moment, Margaret reappeared at the far end of the hall. She paused for half a breath, just enough to sense that something had shifted in the atmosphere. "Everything all right?" she asked. Daniel answered too quickly. "Fine," I said, "nothing." But we both knew that wasn't true. Margaret's eyes moved from him to me. She had the kind of face that revealed very little unless she wanted it to, but I could tell she understood more than either of us had said aloud. "Coffee is ready," she said gently. "I think we should head back to Columbus," I replied. Daniel turned to me. "Emily, it's a long drive," I said, "and I have an early shift." That part was true. I did have rounds at the hospital the next morning, but it wasn't the reason I was leaving, and we all knew it. Margaret nodded slowly. "Of course," she said, and her politeness only made me feel worse. Not because she was unkind, but because she was too composed, too impossible to read. I thanked Robert for dinner. I thanked Margaret for having me. She walked us to the door, and just before I stepped outside, she said quietly, "I hope tonight didn't feel unwelcoming." I looked at her. I could have lied, could have smoothed it over and played the pleasant guest. But I was too tired for that, too emotionally drained to pretend everything was fine. "It felt complicated," I said. Something flickered in her expression. Then so quietly I almost missed it, she said, "I see." The drive back to Columbus was mostly quiet. Daniel kept both hands on the wheel, his eyes on the dark highway ahead. Street lights flashed across the windshield in steady intervals, marking the passage of miles and the passage of time. After 15 minutes, he said, "You think my family set you up?" I thought about the question before answering. I think your family is so used to having money that they don't realize how humiliating it feels to wonder whether your decency is being measured. That's not what happened. Then what did happen? He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "My mother worries about whether people love us for who we are or what we can offer." I turned toward the window. "And I worry about whether rich people ever really believe someone like me belongs in their world." That landed between us with more force than I intended. Daniel didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I hate that you feel that way. I hate that I had a reason to." By the time we reached my condo, I was emotionally exhausted. He parked, but neither of us moved to get out. The dashboard clock glowed 11:07. Daniel looked at me. "I love you," he said, and I believed him. That was the hardest part. Because love doesn't always protect you from pride or class or family history. Sometimes it drops you right into the middle of all three. "I love you too," I said, "but tonight made me feel small." His face tightened. "I'm sorry." I nodded, but I wasn't ready to forgive something I didn't yet understand, wasn't ready to let go of the hurt that had settled into my chest like a stone. Inside, Molly greeted me in a whirl of fur and paws, her tail wagging with the pure joy of reunion. I knelt and scratched behind her ears, breathing in the warm, familiar smell of dog and home. The condo was quiet, ordinary mine. And as I stood in my own kitchen filling Molly's water bowl, I found myself thinking something I didn't want to admit out loud. Maybe the Whittakers hadn't intended to insult me. Maybe Margaret Whittaker truly had been embarrassed at Walmart. Maybe none of it had been staged. But intention and impact are two different things. And whether she meant to or not, Margaret had awakened something old and sore in me. The part that remembered every moment growing up when money entered the room before I did. The part that knew what it felt like to be looked at politely and still somehow not be fully welcomed. I went to bed that night with my mind restless and my heart defensive. And by morning, I wasn't sure whether I was angry at Margaret Whittaker or at all the years behind her that had taught me to expect exactly this. I barely slept that night. Not because Daniel and I had raised our voices. We hadn't. Not because anyone had insulted me openly. They hadn't. It was worse than that. Everything had stayed polite enough to be denied, comfortable enough to be dismissed as my own insecurity. That polished kind of discomfort can keep a person awake far longer than a simple argument ever could. I kept replaying the evening in pieces. Margaret's face in the foyer. Daniel saying, "You've met her before." The look on his face in the hallway when I asked whether Walmart had been some kind of test. The pause before he answered. And then my own reaction, sharp and defensive, though if I was honest with myself, the anger had not been born that evening. It had simply been awakened. The next morning, I went to work tired and out of sorts. At the hospital, there's not much room for private turmoil. Sick hearts don't wait for your feelings to settle. Medications still need to be checked. Charts reviewed. Oxygen adjusted. Family questions answered. That helped in a way. A man in room 412 had gone into atrial fibrillation overnight, and his daughter wanted clear answers nobody could fully give yet. A woman recovering from bypass surgery needed help sitting up and was determined to pretend she didn't need assistance. Real life, immediate and physical, has a way of dragging you out of your own head, forcing you to focus on something larger than your own problems. Still, every quiet moment brought me back to the same question. Had Margaret Whittaker truly been embarrassed at Walmart? Or had I been part of a story already in progress, a quiet little morality play arranged by wealthy people who wanted reassurance that the world still contained decency? By noon, I had a headache sitting right behind my eyes. Daniel texted once around lunchtime. "Can we talk tonight?" I looked at the message for a long time before replying. "Long shift, maybe tomorrow." That was true, though not entirely. What I really meant was, "I'm not ready to hear your defense of your family just yet." He sent back only, "Okay, I love you." That made me feel guilty, which irritated me further. The shift ended around 7. I stopped at a Kroger near home for salad mix and chicken broth, then drove back to my condo under a low gray sky that threatened rain but never quite delivered. Molly met me at the door with the solemn enthusiasm only a golden retriever can manage, tail going, eyes bright, whole body wiggling with forgiveness for the fact that I had left her all day. I changed into sweatpants, fed her, heated up some soup, and was halfway through it when the doorbell rang. At first, I thought it might be Daniel, but when I looked through the peephole, it wasn't him. It was Margaret Whittaker. For a second, I simply stood there staring. She wore a camel-colored coat and held both hands loosely in front of her. No handbag worth a month's rent, no dramatic jewelry, no chauffeur visible through the glass storm door, just Margaret standing on my front step like any ordinary visitor. I opened the door, but only halfway. "Mrs. Whittaker." "Margaret, please," she said. "I hope I'm not intruding." I hesitated. "I didn't know you had my address." "Daniel gave it to me this afternoon. I told him I wanted to speak with you alone, and to his credit, he thought that was probably best." There was something almost dry in her tone, a hint of self-awareness that surprised me. I stepped back and let her in. My condo was modest. Living room, small dining area, galley kitchen, narrow hallway. Nothing in it had ever appeared in a magazine, but it was clean and warm and fully paid for, at least in the sense that I paid for it every single month. Margaret looked around, not critically, just quietly taking it in. Molly approached and leaned against her leg, and Margaret smiled and bent to scratch behind her ears. "Well," she said, "at least someone here is willing to trust me." That disarmed me more than it should have. I motioned toward the couch. "Would you like some coffee?" "No, thank you, I won't stay long." We sat facing each other, my coffee mug still warm in my hands. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she looked directly at me. "I owe you an apology." I hadn't expected that. "For what?" I asked. "For an evening that left you feeling measured instead of welcomed." I stayed quiet. She continued. "I saw it in your face before you left, and I heard enough in the hallway to understand at least part of the misunderstanding." I set my mug down. With respect, it wasn't hard to misunderstand. "No," she said. "It wasn't." That answer caught me off guard. I had expected self-justification, maybe polished reasoning, not agreement. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "Emily, the incident at Walmart was not staged." Her voice was calm, but there was weight behind it. "I want to say that plainly first." I searched her face, trying to detect whether this was the polished truth or the actual one. She seemed to understand that. "You don't know me well enough yet to trust my word," she said. "That's fair, but I'll tell you exactly what happened." She took a slow breath. 3 days before that shopping trip, my handbag was stolen from my car while I was at the garden center. It was my fault, really. I set it down in the passenger seat and forgot to lock the door. By the time I realized it, the credit cards were already being used. I said nothing, but I felt myself lean in slightly. I canceled everything that afternoon, every card, every account tied to that wallet. My assistant later arranged replacements, but one old debit card was still in my coat pocket from a prior trip. I forgot it had already been deactivated. She gave a faint, rueful smile. "So when I stopped at Walmart on the way home and tried to use it, I was not making a social experiment of the checkout lane. I was simply a woman with the wrong card and a very embarrassing lapse in memory." That was so specific. It rang true in the way lies usually don't. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Why didn't you say that last night?" "Because dinner was not the right setting." "And because," she added, "pride is not only a problem among the poor." That landed. I looked down at my hands. She went on. "When my card declined, I was embarrassed, not because of the money itself, because I am accustomed to competence. I'm used to handling things. And there I was, unable to buy soup and bread like any ordinary person." I thought back to the checkout lane, how quickly she had begun removing items, how carefully she had tried not to inconvenience anyone else. It had not looked theatrical. It had looked familiar, like someone trying to hold on to dignity. Margaret's voice softened. "What mattered to me wasn't only that you paid. It was how you did it, quietly, without performance, without lingering for praise. You spared me the humiliation of being turned into a lesson in someone else's generosity." That pierced me a little because she was right. There are people who help in a way that keeps the other person indebted, who make sure everyone knows what they've done. I had seen that too all my life. "I didn't want to embarrass you," I said. "I know," she replied. "That's why I remembered you." We sat with that for a moment. Then I asked the question that still mattered. But Daniel said you sometimes go places where nobody knows who you are. Margaret nodded. I do. That sounds a lot like testing people. It can look that way, she admitted. And perhaps sometimes, if I am not careful, it becomes too close to it. Wealth can make a person suspicious. You begin to wonder whether people see you or merely your circumstances. I crossed my arms, though not as defensively as before. And people without money wonder the same thing in reverse. A shadow of understanding moved across her face. Yes, she said. I think that may be exactly what happened between us. The room was quiet except for Molly shifting on the rug. Margaret leaned back slightly, studying me with more openness than she had shown the night before. Daniel loves you, she said. I looked away for a second. I know. He has loved other women before, nice enough women, impressive women, but never with this much steadiness. She paused. That matters to a mother. I didn't know what to say to that. She continued, and before I ever knew you were the woman he intended to marry, I already knew one thing. When faced with a small, private choice, you chose kindness. I swallowed hard. That doesn't make me a saint. I should hope not, she said, and to my surprise, I almost laughed. Then her expression grew serious again. Emily, I am sorry that our family's history and caution made you feel judged. I cannot promise my husband and I are free from old assumptions. We are not. But I would rather correct a misunderstanding now than let it harden into resentment. That word, resentment, struck me because it was exactly what had begun forming in me. Slowly, against my own resistance, the hard knot inside my chest began to loosen. Not disappear, but loosen. I appreciate you coming here, I said. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't. She smiled faintly. That would have been understandable. I studied her face. She looked elegant, yes. Composed, yes. But suddenly she also looked older than she had the night before. Not weak, just human. A woman shaped by decades of carrying herself a certain way. I thought of my own mother and how quickly dignity can become armor when life has humbled you enough times. So it really was just the wrong card, I said. It really was. And Walmart wasn't some test. No, though perhaps life has a way of turning accidents into revelations. That was a very Margaret Whittaker sentence if ever there was one. I smiled despite myself. When she stood to leave, I walked her to the door. At the threshold, she turned back. For what it's worth, she said, I liked you before I knew who you were. There was no polish in that moment, no performance. Just an older woman, offering truth in the simplest way she knew how. After she left, I stood by the door for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft click of Molly's nails on the floor as she came to stand beside me. The misunderstanding hadn't vanished entirely. There were still deeper things underneath it. Class, pride, old fears, Daniel caught in the middle of worlds. But one thing had changed. The story I had told myself about Margaret Whittaker was no longer clean enough to be comforting. And when our neat explanations begin to crack, that is often when the real truth finally gets room to breathe. After Margaret left that night, the condo felt strangely quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the thoughtful kind. The kind that makes you realize the story in your head might not be the whole story. Molly had curled up beside the couch, her tail occasionally thumping the floor as if she were reminding me the world still contained simple loyalties. I sat there a long time replaying Margaret's words. Pride is not only a problem among the poor. That line stayed with me because if I was honest, some of the anger I had felt toward her family hadn't been about them at all. It had been about history. The long shadow of growing up in a place where money always seemed to arrive in the room before respect did. The next conversation I needed to have wasn't with Margaret. It was with Daniel. The following evening, he came by after work. He looked tired, the way people do when they've spent the day worrying about something they can't quite fix. When I opened the door, Molly greeted him like a returning war hero, and Daniel scratched behind her ears and gave me a cautious smile. Hi. Hi. We stood there for a moment before he stepped inside. The condo suddenly felt very small for a conversation this big. Did my mother come by? He asked. Yes, I motioned toward the couch. Sit. He did. I remained standing for a moment before finally taking the chair opposite him. She explained what happened with the card. Daniel exhaled slowly. Good, it really was canceled. Yes, that would have been nice to know before dinner. He nodded. You're right. His willingness to admit that softened something in me. I thought your family was testing me, I said. I know you did. Can you blame me? No, he replied. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Emily, my parents have spent 40 years building a business. Along the way, they've met people who wanted to be close to that business for the wrong reasons. I understand that, but understanding something and feeling judged by it are two different things. He nodded. That's true, Daniel continued. My mother grew up hearing stories from my grandparents about the Great Depression. My grandfather lost his farm in Kentucky in 1932. For a while, the family lived in a converted barn. I looked up. I didn't know that. Most people don't, Daniel said. By the time I was born, my father had already built the company, but my mother never forgot those stories. That explains why she shops at Walmart partly, and why she worries about money changing people. Yes, he watched me carefully, but there's another part of this we should talk about. What's that? You, I raised an eyebrow. What about me? You've carried something into this relationship too. I crossed my arms. Such as a belief that wealthy people are always waiting to judge you. I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped, because the truth was he wasn't entirely wrong. That belief didn't come from nowhere, I said. I know, my dad worked 30 years in a factory that shut down anyway. I watched my mother count grocery money at the kitchen table more times than I can remember. When people with money talked about hard work, it didn't always feel like they understood what that meant. Daniel listened quietly. I've seen both sides of that, he said. My parents worked incredibly hard, but I also know luck plays a role people don't like to admit. The honesty in that surprised me. I guess what I'm saying, he continued, is that you and my mother are actually worried about the same thing. And what's that? That money can distort the way people see each other. I sat back in the chair. That thought settled into the room like a piece of furniture that had always belonged there. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I said quietly, I felt small at that dinner. Daniel nodded. I know, and that feeling goes back a long way. I know that too. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the small patch of grass behind the condo. My father sometimes says wealth is like wearing a heavy coat. It protects you from certain storms, but it also makes people assume things about you before you open your mouth. I thought about Margaret standing in the Walmart checkout line quietly removing bananas from the counter. Maybe that had been the coat slipping off for a moment. I don't want to be someone who's always on guard around your family, I said. You don't have to be, but I also don't want to pretend class differences don't exist. Daniel turned back toward me. Neither do I, he walked over and sat beside me. Emily, the reason I love you isn't because you impressed my parents. I hope not. It's because you're steady. You don't pretend to be something you're not. And when a stranger needed help buying groceries, you stepped forward without making it a spectacle. That was $52, I said. It wasn't about the amount. Sat quietly together. Molly lifted her head and looked between us like she was supervising the entire conversation. Daniel reached for my hand. This time I didn't pull away. My mother respects you, he said. She barely knows me. She knows enough. I considered that. Maybe respect didn't always come from long familiarity. Sometimes it came from a single moment when no one expected anything from you. There's still something we haven't talked about, I said. What's that? Your father. Daniel chuckled softly. Dad respects practical people. If you work hard and tell the truth, you're already halfway there. That sounds manageable. It is. I squeezed his hand. And Daniel, yeah, if your mother ever runs into trouble at Walmart again, she should probably carry a backup card. He laughed. Noted. The tension in the room finally loosened. Not disappeared completely, but loosened enough to breathe. Later that evening, we walked Molly around the block together. The spring air was cool and smelled faintly of wet pavement and budding trees. Street lights flickered on one by one as the sky darkened. Halfway down the sidewalk, Daniel said something that stayed with me. You know what my mother told me after she met you at Walmart? What? She said that young woman helped someone who couldn't repay her. That's the kind of person who builds a life worth sharing. I looked up at him. She said that? She did. The sidewalk stretched ahead of us in quiet rows of houses and porch lights. For the first time since the dinner in Cincinnati, the future didn't feel like a test. It felt like a road, one we were still learning how to walk together. A misunderstanding can do one of two things. It can harden into a wall, or it can become a doorway if the people involved care more about truth than pride. In the weeks after Margaret came to my condo, things changed slowly the way most worthwhile changes do. Not with a grand speech, not with a sudden miracle, just one honest conversation at a time. Daniel and I drove back to his parents' house 2 Sundays later for lunch. This time I wasn't carrying a casserole dish like armor. I brought a lemon bundt cake and a steadier heart. The house looked the same as before: stone, polished windows, long drive curving through trimmed hedges. But it didn't feel as imposing. Maybe because now I understood that every house, no matter how large, still contains ordinary people carrying ordinary fears. Margaret greeted me at the door herself. She smiled and took the cake from my hands. "I'm glad you came back," she said. "So am I," that was all. No elaborate clearing of the air, no dramatic reference to Walmart, just a simple truth laid down between us like the first board in a bridge. Lunch was quieter than the first dinner, but easier. Robert asked about one of my patients who had made a remarkable recovery. I told him the story without violating any privacy, just enough to explain why some shifts leave you feeling hopeful and others leave you wrung out. Margaret asked for my mother's pound cake recipe and wrote it down in neat handwriting on a recipe card from a drawer in the kitchen. Daniel noticed the change before I did. At one point, he caught my eye across the table and gave me a small smile that said, "There you are. That's the woman I know." Spring moved into summer. Daniel and I grew closer in the plain, practical ways that matter most, arguing over paint colors for the condo we eventually planned to share, laughing over burnt garlic bread, sitting side by side on the couch while Molly snored between us. One afternoon in June, Margaret invited me to go with her to a garden center outside Cincinnati. At first, I thought it might be awkward, but it wasn't. We spent an hour choosing hydrangeas and arguing gently over whether white blooms looked classic or funeral. She had opinions about mulch, strong ones. At one point, while loading bags of potting soil into the trunk, she looked at me and said, "You know, my mother would have liked you." That meant more than she probably realized. Because for women of her generation, and mine too in some ways, approval is not always spoken in dramatic language. Often it appears in practical little sentences, wrapped in ordinary moments. By July, Daniel and I had set a wedding date for early fall. Nothing extravagant. A small ceremony at a chapel near Columbus, followed by a reception at a restored community hall with string lights, simple flowers, and enough good food that nobody would leave hungry. I wanted it to feel like a real wedding, not a performance. Daniel agreed. Margaret surprised me by supporting that completely. "Large weddings are often more expensive than meaningful," she said. Robert grinned and added, "Your future mother-in-law has been waiting 30 years for someone to say that." The wedding day came bright and clear. The chapel smelled faintly of wood polish and lilies. My mother cried before the music even started. Daniel looked at me the way a man looks when he knows exactly what he is choosing. That steadied me. After the ceremony, people gathered at the hall, plates clinked, chairs scraped, and older relatives asked all the usual questions about future grandchildren, as if they were filling out census forms. Late in the evening after dinner, but before cake, Robert stood and tapped his glass lightly. "I promised my wife I would keep this short," he said, which made everyone laugh. Then he turned to Margaret. She insisted on speaking. Margaret rose with one hand on the table. She was elegant as always, but there was a softness in her face I hadn't seen the first night I met her. She looked around the room, then at Daniel and me. "I won't embarrass the bride," she said, which earned a few chuckles. "At least not much." Then her voice grew calmer. "A few months ago, I found myself in a grocery store checkout line with the wrong card in my hand and more pride than sense. A kind woman behind me stepped forward and quietly paid for my groceries. She didn't stay to be thanked properly. She didn't ask my name. She simply helped, then walked away." The room had gone still. Margaret looked at me. I learned later that this same woman loved my son. A few guests smiled. My mother reached for a tissue again. Margaret continued, "There are moments in life when character reveals itself without announcement. Not in grand speeches, not in public achievements, but in private choices when no one is keeping score." Her eyes moved slowly across the room. "My family has been blessed with success, but success can make people forget what matters. It can blur the difference between status and worth. Emily reminded us that true worth still looks like humility, decency, and kindness offered without witness." My throat tightened. Margaret lifted her glass. "To the bride and groom, and to the kind of love that sees people clearly." Glasses rose all around the room. Mine shook a little in my hand. Later that evening, after the last dance and the last slice of cake had been wrapped for someone's drive home, I stood outside the hall under a soft Ohio night. The air was warm. Crickets sounded from the grass. Daniel had gone back inside to help his father gather gifts from the table. Margaret stepped out beside me. For a moment, we stood in silence. Then she said, "Funny, isn't it?" "What is?" "That $52 could turn into a family." I smiled. "It wasn't really about the money." "No," she said, "it never was." We stood there another minute, two women from different backgrounds linked now, not by suspicion, but by understanding. And I realized something I wish I'd understood earlier in life. Most people are carrying old stories. Stories about class, about pride, about what it means to belong. We hurt each other when we let those stories speak louder than the person standing in front of us. But we heal when we choose curiosity over assumption and grace over wounded pride. That is the lesson I carried from Walmart to that wedding night. True wealth is not what sits in a bank. It is the ability to treat another human being with dignity when there is nothing to gain from it. And sometimes the smallest private kindness returns years later as something larger than you ever imagined. So if this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a moment when kindness changed the course of your life, or when an old misunderstanding finally gave way to grace, I hope you'll hold on to that feeling. Share it with someone who may need the reminder. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, full of heartfelt lessons and second chances, I'd be grateful to have you along for the next one. Because no matter our age, we are all still learning how to see each other clearly. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button and tell us in the comments. What's the most meaningful encounter you've had with a stranger? And of course, subscribe for more stories like this. Until next time, remember that kindness costs nothing but means everything.